Hi, everybody! After reuniting with CEO Toan, Tu Diem finds herself standing at the crossroads of truth and silence. Seeing him again brings back everything she tried so hard to bury: love, pain, and the memories that still refuse to fade. Yet beneath her calm expression lies a secret growing quietly within her, one that could change both of their lives forever. Should she tell him that she is pregnant? Each time she opens her mouth, fear holds her back. What if this truth binds them together in ways neither is ready for? What if it becomes another wound instead of a promise? As Tu Diem struggles between courage and hesitation, fate waits patiently for her choice. Because sometimes the hardest words to say are the ones that matter the most. Life rarely announces its turning points. Sometimes it lets them arrive quietly, like a familiar face appearing in a crowded street. On the day Tu Diem met CEO Toan again, the world did not stop spinning, but her heart did. It was an ordinary morning, the kind that smelled of coffee and dust, of people rushing past with their own worries. Tu Diem stood near the window of a small cafe, her fingers wrapped around a cup she had forgotten to drink. When the door opened and Toan stepped inside, time seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether to move forward or slip back into memory. He looked different, leaner, calmer, with a trace of distance in his eyes. Yet something about the way he walked, the way his gaze wandered before settling on her, felt painfully familiar. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Words, once so easy between them, now felt heavy, loaded with everything that had been lost. "Toan," her voice trembled, betraying the strength she had practiced every day in his absence. He smiled politely, then paused, as if her name had stirred something deep and unnamed. "We've met before, haven't we?" he asked gently, the question cutting deeper than any accusation could. Tu Diem nodded, forcing a small smile. How could she explain years of love, of shared dreams, of nights filled with laughter and tears, when his memories had been erased like chalk from a board? She told herself to breathe, to stay steady, just like any ordinary woman meeting an old acquaintance. Yet her hand instinctively moved to her abdomen, a silent gesture she quickly hid. They sat across from each other, speaking of simple things: work, weather, the city that had changed so much. But beneath the surface, unspoken emotions pulsed like a second conversation. Toan felt it too, a strange warmth, a pull he couldn't name, as if his heart recognized her long before his mind could. Outside, people hurried to jobs they didn't love, carrying burdens they rarely shared. Inside that cafe, Tu Diem faced her own quiet storm. She had found him again. Fate had brought them back to the same place. Yet the greatest truth of all remained locked within her, one that could change everything. As Toan stood to leave, he turned back once more, his eyes lingering on her face. "I don't know why," he said softly, "but meeting you feels important." Tu Diem watched him go, her heart pounding with hope and fear intertwined. The reunion had happened, but the hardest question still waited for its moment to be asked. That night, the city grew quiet in the way it always does after pretending to be busy all day. Tu Diem lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small room, listening to the distant hum of motorbikes fading into memory. The reunion replayed itself again and again in her mind. Toan's eyes, his hesitant smile, the way he said her name as if it belonged to someone he almost remembered. She placed a hand over her stomach, her breath slowing. The doctor's words echoed softly inside her head, gentle yet life-altering. A new heartbeat had begun, fragile and unseen. And with it came a question that refused to let her rest. Is this child his? Tu Diem had always believed she was strong. Life had taught her how to endure silence, how to swallow pain and keep walking. But this secret felt heavier than all the others combined. If she told him now, would it awaken love or destroy the fragile connection they had just rediscovered? And if she stayed silent, would fate forgive her for protecting her heart? The next day, life continued as if nothing had changed. She went to work, greeted strangers, counted small coins, and smiled at customers who had no idea how carefully she was holding herself together. Every pregnant woman on the street made her pause. Every child's laughter pulled at something deep inside her chest. Ordinary scenes became mirrors, reflecting the future she was too afraid to imagine. Toan called her that evening. His voice sounded calm, curious, almost too polite. "I don't know why," he said, "but I keep thinking about you. Would you like to have dinner?" Her heart raced. She agreed, even as fear tightened around her ribs. At the restaurant, they talked more easily this time. Toan laughed, and for a brief moment, the man she loved seemed to return, just for a second. He spoke about pressure, about losing parts of himself he couldn't explain, about feeling incomplete in ways success could not fix. Tu Diem listened quietly, wondering if he felt the same pull she did, this invisible thread stretching between them. She wanted to tell him everything, about the nights she cried alone, about the child growing inside her, about the love that had never truly left. But when Toan looked at her and said, "I feel like my life started again after I forgot everything," her courage faltered. How could she bring the past crashing back into a life he was only beginning to rebuild? She smiled, hiding the storm within. Outside, couples walked hand in hand, families shared late dinners, and the world moved on, unaware of the fragile balance Tu Diem was trying to protect. She left that night with her secret still intact, unsure whether silence was an act of love or the beginning of another heartbreak. Morning arrived with a pale, hesitant light, as if the sun itself was unsure whether to reveal everything it touched. Tu Diem stood at the bus stop, surrounded by strangers scrolling through their phones, mothers adjusting their children's backpacks, workers rushing toward another long day. Life moved forward with quiet determination, while inside her, a decision waited to be made. Her body had begun to change in small, undeniable ways. A sudden wave of nausea, a moment of dizziness, a heartbeat that felt louder than usual. Each sensation reminded her that time was no longer something she could pause. The child within her was growing, silently urging her toward the truth. Later that afternoon, Tu Diem met Toan again. This time they walked instead of sitting, side by side along a narrow street lined with old trees and small shops. The air smelled of street food and rain-soaked pavement. It felt ordinary, almost comforting, like a life they could have lived if fate had been kinder. Toan spoke about his days at work, about the strange emptiness that followed him home each night. "It's like I'm missing a chapter," he admitted, stopping beneath a tree whose leaves whispered in the breeze. "I don't know what it is, but sometimes I feel guilty for forgetting something important." Tu Diem's heart tightened. She looked at him, really looked, at the man who had once promised to protect her, who now stood vulnerable in a different way. The words rose to her lips, trembling, desperate to be spoken. "I'm pregnant. You're going to be a father." But fear held her back. What if he didn't believe her? What if he felt trapped, burdened by a responsibility he didn't remember choosing? Love, she realized, was not only about honesty, it was also about timing. They continued walking until they reached a small playground. Children ran past them, their laughter ringing like tiny bells. Toan watched them quietly, his expression softening in a way he didn't notice himself. For a moment, his hand brushed against Tu Diem's. The contact sent a shock through her, gentle yet powerful. "Do you ever feel," he asked suddenly, "like some people are tied to us by something we can't see?" She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "All the time." As they parted ways, Tu Diem felt both closer to him and further away than ever. She had almost told him, almost changed everything, yet the truth remained unspoken, growing heavier with each passing day. That night, she wrote in her journal, a habit she had kept through all the waiting. "If I speak, I risk losing him. If I stay silent, I risk losing myself."
Outside her window, the city lights flickered, indifferent yet familiar. The question was no longer whether she would tell him, but when.
The day Tu Diem decided to speak, the rain came without warning. It drummed softly on rooftops and umbrellas, washing the streets clean as if the city itself were preparing for a confession. She stood by the window of her small apartment, one hand resting unconsciously on her abdomen, listening to the steady rhythm of her own breath. Life, she realized, never waits for us to feel ready. She met Toan that evening at a quiet cafe tucked between a flower shop and a bookstore, one of those places people pass every day without noticing, yet remember forever when something important happens there. The cafe was warm, filled with a scent of coffee and old paper. Outside, people hurried past, carrying groceries, worries, and dreams much like hers. Toan looked different, calmer, as if the fragments of his lost memories were slowly finding their way back home. He spoke of a dream he'd had the night before, a woman crying in the rain, a promise he couldn't quite hear, a child's laughter echoing in the distance. It felt real, he said quietly, too real to ignore. Toan's heart pounded. This was the moment, the invisible thread pulled tight, leaving no space for silence. Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around her cup. "Toan," she began, her voice uneven but sincere. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said a long time ago." Time seemed to slow. The cafe noise faded, replaced by the sound of rain against glass. She told him everything, about the pregnancy, about her fear, about loving him even when he couldn't remember her. Each word felt like a step across a fragile bridge. For a long moment, Toan said nothing. His eyes searched her face, as if trying to recognize a memory hidden beneath her tears. Then, slowly, something shifted. A sharp breath, a hand pressed against his temple. Images flooded back, hospital lights, her voice calling his name, his own promise to never leave. "I remember," he whispered, tears forming despite his attempt to remain strong. Not all of it, but enough. He reached for her hand, grounding them both in the present. Outside, the rain eased into a gentle drizzle. Life resumed its ordinary pace, yet for them, everything had changed. They left the cafe together, stepping into the damp evening. Around them, the city glowed softly, indifferent yet forgiving. The future was still uncertain, still fragile, but the thread that bound them had never broken. And this time, they chose to hold it, together.